In this lesson, we're going to be introducing variables, and I'm also going to be writing the JavaScript within the apps.js.
This video is brought to you by EpiPy's Academy.
So this is the same thing as writing it within the script tags, but it also gives me the ability to link out to app.js on multiple web pages, giving me a whole lot more flexibility with my JavaScript and also the option of bringing it across multiple pages. So we're going to really minimize index over here, and we're going to jump into apps.js. And whenever we're loading apps.js, so I'm just going to refresh it here, and we've got the console open here. So if we do encounter any errors, or if we want to pass any messages between our script and our browser, we can do that within the console. So variables are an important part of any programming because they're used to contain and store data values that are reusable within your source code. And data and variables are really easy to set up. Usually they're at the beginning of the script because first thing that you do when you come into your program, you define different variables. And in order to define a variable, we start out with var, and then we need to give it a name. So there are some rules to naming variables. You can start it with any letter, you can start it with an underscore, and you can start it with a $sign. And you're restricted to those three options because of the fact the way that JavaScript works, and we are going to look at this later on as we progress through this course. So first of all, let's start out by giving it a var, so a variable a, and assigning a value to it. And also it's important to note that after you've defined the first character, you can use numbers as well. So this variable can contain 1, 2, 3, 4. Also important to note that var a is actually going to be different than if we do var uppercase a. So it is case sensitive, and lowercase a, uppercase a are both different variables. So always keep that in mind, case sensitive, and make sure that you're not using different cases when you're referencing the variable within your code. Another thing to keep in mind as well, that there are certain reserved words such as array and other reserved words within JavaScript. So when you are doing your naming convention, make sure that it makes sense. So if you're doing something where you've got maybe the last name of a person and you want to hold the variable in there, then you can do it like in this type of format where we start out with lowercase, the first word is lowercase, no space. Make sure that you're not adding any spaces. Spaces are not allowed within the variable name, and then we start out with the uppercase for the next word. So this would be a typical variable that we could hold, and then we need to assign a value to it. So we have different types of variables within JavaScript. We've got string values where we've got a value that's contained within quotes. So it can be a single quote, it can be a double quote. So either way we can contain those values within the quotes. Also, there is a numeric. So I'm just going to comment it out here. So do remember how to do comment. Comment is 2 backslashes. So we're going to reference this as a string. Next, we're going to look at age. And so this is going to be a numeric, a number value. And with numeric values, we don't need to include any quotes. And that's what the real difference is between strings and integer variables. Those are the two different types that we've got. We've got quotes around the strings and no quotes around the integer. And there's also another variable type that's used fairly often, and this is a Boolean value. So just give it a name of boo, and these ones can either be true or false. So again, there's no quotes around it, and it can be true or false. So this is what's known as Boolean. So now that we've accessed and created these variables, we can make use of them within our code. And that's where the real power of variables comes in, because we have the ability to reference any one of these values and even work with these values within our code. So say for instance we had age, and we can equal age equals age plus 10, And so now the value of age is going to be age, which started out as 10, plus another 10, so the value of age is going to be 20. So we need a way to actually see what the value of age is and how it's increasing. And that's where we use console log. And as mentioned before, this is our way of actually outputting content into the console, making it visible for when you're rendering out the web page, because we don't have any actual HTML that we're updating here. We're not updating anything within the visible web page, but we are sending information back within the console, and this again is meant for debugging and troubleshooting. So when I refresh the page, I see that the first console log on line 4, so again here's the code, console line number 4, and renders out the value of age, which is 10. Console log on line 6 of the code renders out age, and it's 20 now because we've incremented it by 10. And essentially this is how we can work with JavaScript and create different values, hold values within variables, and then work with those values to reassign different variables. So you're probably also wondering, well, what happens if I create a variable, but I actually don't have a value that I want to define to it quite yet? And this is often done as well within JavaScript, where we've got a variable and we don't actually know what the contained value is going to be. So there's going to be a difference between the way JavaScript handles it if we've got so I'm going to try to pull out last name before I define the variable, and then next I'm going to define the variable, but we see we still don't have a value assigned to it, and then next I'm going to assign a value to this variable. And since the variable has already been declared with var, all I need to do is assign a value to it. So we can assign a value to it, any value that we want. So I'm going to use a string value and assign JavaScript to it. So now we're going to see that when the code renders out, the first time it hits last name, it's not going to know because this isn't going to be a defined variable. Next, it's going to be an undefined variable, but we've defined it as a variable. And then lastly, we've assigned a value to it with the assignment operator here, the equal sign, and then the value of last name is going to be the contents of that variable. So let's see what happens. So we see that first it renders it out and it's undefined. Next, we've defined we've declared the variable over here, but we haven't assigned any value to it, and the default value to a variable is also undefined. And then over here we've got last name, and we've actually defined a value to it, and that's when we render it out in the console, we see that the value is JavaScript. Now you're probably wondering, well, why didn't it throw an error? Because it has our console log last name, but we actually haven't declared that variable as a variable, and it's not throwing any error, but it's just returning back that undefined value. And that's because of the way that JavaScript actually renders out the code. So as long as you're declaring that variable at some point within your code, you're not going to hit any errors. But watch what happens when I remove that. So I've just commented out, and now when I refresh it, we see that we get an error over here on line number 8, and this is a critical error because it actually stops the rendering out of the rest of the JavaScript code, because right now we're referencing a value, a variable that isn't declared. So this just basically means that if you're using a variable, you can actually declare it at anywhere within the script, and when you do declare it, when you assign a value to it, anything after you've assigned a value to it, that's where it actually holds that value. And it's important to understand this because again, most of the time when you're declaring variables, you keep them at the top, just for this, because you don't want to be searching through your application, especially if you've got a lot of lines of code, and going back to see that variable value that it's been actually declared and where it's being declared. So usually keep them all at the top as best practice. And again, just important to note that if you want to access a variable, if you want to make any use of it, even if you're not assigning any value to it yet, just make sure that you declare it, because in instances where you're trying to access it and it hasn't been declared, then you could run into some problems with your script not rendering out and stopping the execution of that script. So we saw how we could add values to an integer value, and there's a number of other ways that we can do this within JavaScript. So there's more functionality, mathematical functionality within JavaScript, and we're going to take a closer look at what we can actually do with these variables in the upcoming lesson.